Imagine it's March 14th, 1994. You are a 38-year-old textile factory supervisor living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your name is Roberto. Your apartment is small but clean, 2 bedrooms on the 4th floor of a concrete building in the Palermo district. You have been saving for 11 years. Your savings account holds the equivalent of $14,000, the product of careful living, overtime shifts, and sacrifices you and your wife made. You made these sacrifices so that your daughter could one day go to university. You remember the 80s. You remember what it felt like. You remember what it felt like when the money in your wallet meant something different by Friday than it did on Monday. But that was then. The economists on television keep telling you that Argentina has turned a corner. The currency is stable. The plan is working. The worst is behind you. If you have ever wondered why some countries manage to kill inflation without triggering the economic collapse that is supposed to be inevitable, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before. And not every version of this story ends the way the textbooks say it must. Most people believe there's only one way to beat inflation, that the medicine is always as painful as the disease. But history tells a different story. It is a messier, more complicated, and in some ways more hopeful story. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds. Subscribing keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because here is what Roberto did not know in 1994. He did not know that the stability he was living inside was borrowed, that the mechanism keeping prices calm was also quietly building pressure beneath the surface. And he did not know that across the world, in a country he had never visited, with a culture entirely different from his own, a government had just made a series of decisions that would accomplish what his country was attempting without the catastrophic ending. That country was Iceland. And then Israel. And then, most surprisingly of all, Poland. The story of how they did it, and why Argentina eventually could not, is the story this video is about. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Inflation, at its core, is not really about prices. People think inflation means prices going up. But that is only the symptom. Inflation is about trust. It is about what people believe money is worth. Think of it this way. Money is not a physical thing. It is a promise. A government promises that this piece of paper or this number in your bank account can be exchanged for real things of real value. The moment people stop believing that promise, prices rise, because everyone rushes to exchange their paper for something real before the promise gets worse. It becomes a self-fulfilling spiral. Prices rise because people expect prices to rise. And so the orthodox treatment, the one most economists prescribe, is to make the medicine bitter. The medicine must be so bitter that people believe the government is serious. Raise interest rates so high that borrowing becomes painful. Slow the economy down until unemployment rises. Hurt people enough that the spiral breaks. The famous phrase associated with this approach came from Paul Volcker, the U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman who crushed American inflation in the early 1980s. He did this by raising interest rates to 20%. 20%. He famously said that the only cure for inflation was a recession, and for decades that was the accepted wisdom. But it was not the only path. And understanding why requires us to look at what inflation actually is down in its machinery, not just at its surface. Inflation has 2 parents. The first is too much money chasing too few goods. When a government prints money faster than the economy, produces things to buy, prices rise. The second parent is expectations. If workers expect prices to double next year, they demand higher wages now. If businesses expect costs to rise, they raise prices now. And both of those expectations create the very thing they are predicting. This is called an inflationary spiral. It is like a fire that feeds on itself. The orthodox treatment, the Volcker treatment, kills the fire by removing the oxygen. But there are other ways to fight fire. And the countries that found those other ways changed the way we think about what is actually possible. This brings us directly to the first case study, Israel, 1985, and one of the most dramatic economic interventions in modern history. By the summer of 1985, Israel was in the grip of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation means prices rising so fast that money loses meaningful value almost daily. Israeli inflation had reached 450% annually. Think about what that means in real life. A loaf of bread that cost 1 shekel on January 1st might cost 4.5 shekels by December 31st. Prices were changing midweek. Shopkeepers were repricing goods every few days. Workers demanded wage increases constantly to keep up. The government had been printing money to cover its deficits, which means it was spending more than it was collecting in taxes and borrowing the difference from its own printing press. The mechanism was textbook. Too much money, eroding trust, rising prices, wages chasing prices, prices chasing wages, a spiral. The conventional path was clear: cut spending, raise rates, accept unemployment, accept pain. Let the spiral tire itself out through suffering. But the Israeli government in 1985 did something different. They called it the Economic Stabilization Plan, and it was designed by a team that included the American economist Stanley Fischer. Stanley Fischer would later become the vice chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. He worked with Israeli economists Herbert Stein and Michael Bruno. What they built was essentially a coordinated shock. Not a shock through pain, but a shock through coordination. The government, the labor unions, and the business associations all agreed simultaneously to freeze wages, freeze prices, and cut the government deficit. Not gradually, immediately, all at once. The government cut its deficit from 17% of GDP to nearly zero within a single year. GDP means gross domestic product, which is the total value of everything a country produces, a measure of the size of its economy. At the same time, the shekel was pegged, which means fixed at a set rate, to the US dollar, giving people an anchor, something to believe in. And here's the crucial part. Because all three sides of the economy moved at the same time, the expectations spiral broke. Businesses did not need to raise prices because wages were frozen. Workers did not demand higher wages because prices were frozen. And because both sides held, the freeze held. Inflation in Israel fell from 450% in 1984 to 20% within a single year. Within 2 years, it was in single digits. No deep recession. Unemployment rose modestly, but did not spike. The economy did not collapse. It stabilized. This was not supposed to be possible. The story of Israel 1985 reveals something the textbooks underemphasize. Inflation is partly a coordination problem, a social problem, not just a monetary one. When everyone expects prices to rise, they behave in ways that make prices rise. The solution is not always to make people so miserable that they stop. Sometimes the solution is to make all parties stop at once, by agreement, by coordination, by breaking the expectation in a single sharp move, rather than grinding it down. It is the difference between cutting a rope and fraying it slowly. Israel chose the cut. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When you hear the word austerity, which means cutting government spending to reduce deficits, what do you picture? Do you picture empty hospitals, unemployed workers, collapsed pensions? Or do you picture something more targeted, a surgical reduction that preserves the essential while cutting the wasteful? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. This leads us to the second part of the story. Poland, 1990, and the beginning of what economists called shock therapy, but a version of it that actually worked mostly. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Empire began to collapse, and the countries of Eastern Europe were suddenly faced with the task of converting from centrally planned economies. They needed to move to market economies, where prices are set by supply and demand. This transition, which economists call liberalization, created an immediate inflation crisis. In Poland, inflation had already reached over 500% annually by 1989. The shelves in state shops were empty. The currency, the zloty, was so distrusted that Poles were keeping their savings in US dollars and bartering goods on the black market. A black market is an informal, illegal economy that emerges when the official economy fails to deliver what people need. The Polish government, under Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz, launched what became known as the Balcerowicz Plan in January 1990. It was an aggressive economic reform package. The government freed prices from state control almost overnight. It opened the currency to international exchange. It slashed subsidies, which are government payments that keep prices artificially low. Subsidies to state-owned businesses were cut and interest rates raised. In the first month, prices jumped dramatically as the artificial price controls were removed. Inflation hit over 250% in 1990. But then something unexpected happened. It fell sharply. By 1991, it was below 70%. By 1993, below 35%. By 1996, under 20%. And crucially, Poland's economy did not collapse into depression. It contracted initially, but it recovered faster. By 1992, Poland was growing again. By the mid-1990s, it was the fastest growing economy in Europe. What made Poland different was the combination of the Israeli lesson and credibility. When people saw that the government was actually cutting spending, removing subsidies, and allowing the currency to be held to account, they updated their expectations. The spiral broke. Poland also benefited from Western support, including a debt relief deal and a stabilization fund worth $1 billion that served as a reserve backing the currency. Now here is where it gets interesting. Poland and Israel both used some form of pain, but they broke the spiral faster by making the commitment undeniable and immediate. The pain was real, but concentrated. And crucially, it was followed much faster by recovery. But there's a third case study, Iceland, 2008 to 2012. Iceland is a small island nation with a population of roughly 330,000 people. In 2008, it suffered what was proportionally the largest banking collapse in history. Its three major banks had assets equivalent to 10 times Iceland's annual GDP. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, all three collapsed within days of each other. The Icelandic krona lost approximately half its value almost overnight. Inflation surged past 18%. The country was, by every conventional measure, finished. Iceland did go to the IMF, but it let the banks fail. It did not bail them out. Foreign creditors who had lent money to Icelandic banks lost their money. Iceland imposed capital controls, which temporarily prevented money from being moved out of the country, protecting its domestic economy from a total currency flight. It devalued its currency deliberately, which made Icelandic exports cheap and imports expensive, protecting local industry, and it protected its social safety net. Welfare payments, healthcare, and pensions were largely maintained even as other spending was cut. The burden fell on foreign creditors and the financial sector, not on ordinary Icelandic households. The results were startling. Iceland's economy contracted by around 10% between 2008 and 2010, which is serious but not catastrophic. But by 2011, it was growing again. By 2014, its unemployment rate had fallen back to below 5%. By 2015, it had paid back its IMF loans ahead of schedule. Its inflation, which had peaked at 18%, had returned to below 3% by 2012. And Icelandic citizens, while they experienced real hardship, did not see the kind of generational poverty destruction that hit Greek citizens, who followed a more conventional and more internationally demanded austerity path. Greece saw its economy shrink by 25% over 5 years. Youth unemployment in Greece reached 60%. Iceland, by contrast, was largely recovered within 5 years of its crisis. The rot was in the banks, not in the productive economy. Iceland chose to let the rot be cut out rather than transferred to taxpayers. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, keep assuming that when a government says there is no other choice, there genuinely is no other choice. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks, the part where we zoom out and see all three stories together and realize we have been looking at the same mechanism in 3 different costumes. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Israel, 1985, Poland, 1990, Iceland, 2008, 3 countries, 3 different decades, 3 different types of inflation crisis. And yet, when you lay them side by side, the same mechanism appears in each one. First, a decisive break. In every case, the government made a move that was sharp, visible, and credible. Not a gradual adjustment, not a slow tightening. A break, a signal so clear that people's expectations could update immediately rather than waiting for years of evidence. Israel froze wages and prices simultaneously in a coordinated pact. Poland freed prices and reformed the currency in a single package overnight. Iceland let the banks fail in a public and irreversible act. In each case, the message was the same. The old rules no longer apply. We are in a new system now, believe it. Second, in each case, the government found a way to distribute the pain, so that it did not fall entirely on ordinary citizens. Israel used a wage and price freeze that temporarily protected real living standards while the spiral broke. Poland provided social protections alongside the market liberalization. Iceland shifted the losses to foreign creditors and bank shareholders rather than to domestic depositors and workers. This is not altruism, it is stability management. When ordinary people bear too much of the immediate pain, they stop trusting the system. They vote out the government, they pull their money from banks, and the reform collapses before it can work. The successful unconventional approaches understood that the political economy, which means the relationship between economic policy and political survival, was as important as the economic mechanism itself. Third, all 3 were anchored. Israel pegged to the dollar, Poland backed its currency with a hard reserve fund, Iceland used temporary capital controls to stop the bleeding while it rebuilt. An anchor is not a permanent solution, it is a tourniquet. It stops the bleeding long enough for the patient to stabilize. What you anchor to matters less than the act of anchoring, of giving people something to hold on to while trust is being rebuilt from scratch. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Trust can be rebuilt, inflation can be broken, and the conventional painful playbook is not the only instrument in the orchestra. And this is where history gets uncomfortable, because not every country had the structural conditions to pull off an unconventional stabilization. And the people who paid the price for that failure were not the ones who designed the systems. They were the ones who lived inside them. Go back to Roberto in Buenos Aires in 1994. Argentina's convertibility plan, introduced in 1991 by Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, had pegged the peso to the US dollar 1-to-1. The anchor held for 10 years. Inflation did fall dramatically, from over 3,000% in 1989 to near zero by 1994. Roberto's savings held their value. The groceries cost what they cost. Life felt normal. But the mechanism was fragile. Unlike Israel's freeze, which was backed by deep deficit cuts, Argentina's convertibility was backed by an assumption that foreign capital would keep flowing in, that the government could keep borrowing, that the dollar peg could be maintained indefinitely. It was an anchor made of debt, not of reserves. And when global conditions shifted, when Brazil devalued in 1999, when U.S. interest rates rose, when Argentina's exports became uncompetitive, the anchor started dragging the country down rather than holding it up. By 2001, Argentina's economy was contracting. Unemployment was approaching 20%. The government froze bank accounts in a desperate measure called the corralito, which means the little fence. Roberto's $14,000 in savings were locked inside a bank he could not access. Restrictions limited withdrawals. In December 2001, Argentina defaulted on its sovereign debt, the largest default in history at the time, amounting to over $93 billion. The peso devalued by 70% almost overnight. When the corralito eventually lifted and Roberto could access his account, the money was still there in numbers, but it was worth a fraction of what it had been. His 11 years of savings had been quietly destroyed, not by inflation directly, but by the attempt to defeat inflation with the wrong anchor and the wrong structural conditions for too long. What separated Argentina from Israel was not the intention, but the foundation. Israel's stabilization was built on genuine deficit reduction and genuine social coordination. Argentina's was built on borrowed credibility and external capital flows. When the external conditions changed, the foundation was gone and the anchor became a millstone. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record of these episodes reveals 3 characteristics. The first is diversification of currency exposure. This is a pattern, not a recommendation. But across multiple historical episodes, individuals who held assets in more than one currency or more than one country fared better when their domestic currency was debased, which means deliberately reduced in value by the government. Debased is an old word. It originally referred to reducing the gold content of coins. Today, it means engineering a reduction in purchasing power. In Argentina in 2001, those who had managed to hold dollar-denominated assets outside the banking system retained more of their wealth. In real estate, in foreign accounts opened legally before the restrictions, in physical dollars held privately through the devaluation. This is not a clever trick. It is a historical observation about what kinds of asset structures proved more resilient. The second characteristic is an understanding of the difference between nominal and real value. Nominal value is the number on your account statement. Real value is what that number can actually buy. People who maintained their real value owned assets whose prices tend to rise with inflation. Real property in stable jurisdictions, businesses with pricing power, commodities. Those who held purely nominal assets saw their wealth erode. The third characteristic is perhaps the most psychological. It is the willingness to update expectations early, before the majority has. In every case study, there was a period during which the signs of instability were visible but not yet broadly acknowledged. In Argentina, there were years of mounting deficit problems. In Iceland, the banking sector's extraordinary leverage was visible years before. In Israel in 1984, the trajectory of government deficits was not hidden. Those who read those signs early suffered far less. This is not paranoia. It is historical pattern recognition. The autopsy reveals that the warning signs were present, but not believed until too late. And this is where we return to Roberto. Because Roberto's story does not end in 2001 entirely in tragedy, though it was devastating. He was resilient. He owned his apartment outright and had skills the economy needed. By 2005, the economy was recovering at 8% annually. Roberto's savings never recovered, but he did. That is the deepest lesson. An economy is not a spreadsheet. It is human beings. Change what people believe, credibly and decisively, and you change the economy. Israel, Poland, and Iceland understood this. Argentina did not. History shows how these patterns resolve. It is not financial advice. Consult a professional before making any financial decision of significance. If someone is asking questions about why prices rise, share this video. Seeing clearly is where everything starts. Subscribe for more.